And so once again, just want to say aloha to everybody and welcome to this webinar during Hawaiʻi Invasive Species Awareness Month. My name's Chelsea. I'm a planner with Hawaiʻi Invasive Species Council, and I also have Layla Kaufman here helping out with the webinar today, also from Hawaiʻi Invasive Species Council. And we have a really exciting webinar today titled Chasing the Fastest Growing Tree in the World, Albizia. And today we have presenting Frankie Koethe. She is the Community Outreach Liaison for the Koʻolau Mountains Watershed Partnership. She's born and raised in Kunia, Oʻahu, and received her master's degree from the University of Hawaii in Natural Resource and Environmental Management. And she's also partnership advisor for the Hawaii Women Farmers Network. So she has a really cool background in agriculture and conservation. We also have co-presenting Dylan Davis. He is the GIS and data technician for the Koʻolau Mountains Watershed Partnership. He is born and raised in North Carolina, but also moved around to different places. He worked at the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore and taught English in China. And he's also a certified unmanned aerial vehicle operator, or just drones. He can operate drones, which is really cool. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to our presenters.
All right, thanks so much, Chelsea and Layla. So I'm gonna share my screen. All right, looking good? Awesome.
Looks good.
Sweet, thanks. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. Again, I'm Frankie, and Dylan and I are going to be tag teaming this presentation to give you guys some overview information on Albizia and why we're calling it the fastest growing tree in the world, especially in Hawaii, and then what KMWP is doing to chase these trees down in the Koʻolau Mountains. So yeah, we'll get started. So just some general knowledge on Albizia, or Falcataria moluccana. For those who aren't in the conservation world, a lot of us refer to it as falmol, the first three letters of the genus and species. So you might hear us refer to it, or if you want to sound really cool, just call it falmol. It's originally native from Papua New Guinea, parts of Indonesia, and the Solomon Islands. And it was introduced to Hawaii in the early 1900s, which is about the same time that Hawaii was experiencing major erosion issues, scarce water conditions because of deforestation. So along with other trees that were brought in, like cook pines, Albizia was one of those strategic trees that were brought in. About 140,000 trees were planted, and they were brought in because of their fast growing pace. So they did their job at the time, which was to hold soil in. But these trees grow at alarming rates in Hawaii because of the nice climate conditions that Hawaii has to offer. So they can grow about 15 feet per year, up to 100 feet tall after a certain point, usually like after like the 6 and 7 year mark, the trees will start to taper off at 100 feet and then slowly grow and thicken at the girth of the trunk more so, making them real beasties. And approximately 20,000 acres are infested on Oʻahu with Albizia, but this number is a couple years old. So expect that acreage to be way higher than it is now. So it's invasive because it can take over landscapes and shade out our native species, really lowering the biodiversity that we have. So if you're trying to remember what Albizia looks like, it probably is a little bit more familiar from the highway or in your neighborhoods in the back pockets of those greenscapes, kind of having that dome-shaped top that it's known for, with some flatter tops and just really high canopies. So you can see that the canopy, it's really only Albizia, it's monotypic, one species, and then the lower regions, you're not really going to find as much natives in areas and pockets of high populated Albizia. So the problem with these Albizia, not that they're just fast growing, but because they're so tall and get so big so quickly, their limbs are extremely brittle, and they can break at random, a gust of wind, or just, I feel like falling today, so the limb falls. And that's called sudden limb shear. In the arborist world, also known as widowmakers. They're really, really dangerous, very heavy. And if you're unlucky, like I was one time, I did get to see one fall on the H3 and just kind of taper off and fall off. So these guys are pretty scary, and very large. So the other issue with Albizia is that they are nitrogen fixing, and they can thrive in environments uh, that are nutrient deficient, like our upper regions of native forests, where we need those biodiversity plants in order to supply our water and our aquifer system. But if these Albizia get in, they can do just fine and grow multiple plants and then shade out our natives. So it really can put a damper on our intact native forests. And then after about 3 years, just 3 years, these trees can mature enough that the seeds are good to go, and they can travel by wind for far distances, valley to valley, ridge to ridge, potentially island to island, because of their light weight. So they move quickly, they're fast growing, and they can take out a native ecosystem potentially. And really the danger to our communities is the infrastructure damage it can cause. So if you go back to 2014 and you remember Tropical Storm Iselle, how it wrecked the Puna area, they were out of power and the roads were closed for weeks. And a lot of that was due to Albizia damage. And these trees can fall, collapse, and then block culverts and power lines, potentially leading to flooding and loss of our public services that we need every day. So more Albizia trees, more storms is gonna cause a lot of cost and damage to us. So yeah, these guys are gnarly. And this little graphic just shows within a 5-year span, these trees can really, really get big, much bigger than us. And they're very costly to take out after a certain point. So another issue with Albizia is once they've come in and matured, it makes a great host for other invasive species, like this area in the Koʻolau Mountains. Now that Albizia is established underneath, it's a great home for Mule's foot fern, or Angiopteris evectica, which is another tough invasive species. And usually that attracts our field staff to come out to these areas as well. And this is what it looks like from drone imagery. This is all Albizia falmo canopy, and underneath is, that's all Mule's foot fern. So you can really see how the landscape has changed from something that might be ohia, koa, uluhe to a two-species environment that's not exactly healthy for our watershed systems. And so just to give you a snapshot of an Albizia over time, it's gonna be pretty small, look kind of cute, kind of like a halekoa in its first couple months of life. And then after that, expect those trees to jump up 15 feet every year. So in that first year, it could be 15 feet, could be 7 feet. They're still gonna be pretty thin and small. And then after that, they jump to 20 to 30 feet. And that 4 to 5 year mark, again, it could be 60 feet, it could be 80 feet. It really just depends. And once you hit after 5 years, you're looking at a real monster tree that's gonna come in and can make a nice home for other invasives and more Albizia. And that tree is just gonna get so thick and big, and these limbs are just gonna come down whenever they want. So KMWP has multiple strategies for removing Albizia or trying to target them, because they are widespread across the Koʻolau Mountains. It's really finding the right sustainably, economically and environmentally, how to take out these Albizia trees so that it doesn't hinder our watershed system. So for those small trees, really, we don't use chemical for removing these trees. They can just be pulled out by the root, which is great. A small tree that's maybe 1 year old, if the soil's soft enough, yeah, one person could do it, or two people can work together and pull that tree out. But once they hit that 10 to 20 foot mark, they're way too big to pull out by hand. And so now we have two different options that we use. One is incision point application, which requires herbicide, and then the other is ring barking. And these two strategies are used for trees that are past the 5-year mark as well. So the other thing I didn't note is the reason we're not cutting these trees down is because KMWP is working in remote areas of the Koʻolau Mountains, which Dylan's going to talk about, but it's not a viable option to bring a chainsaw out and cut these down. It's one, it's not safe, and two, it's not economically viable. So the first option that we talked about was ring barking, and this is really starving the tree from its nutrients and water and removing that outer layer of the cambium and stripping it all the way down to the base of the tree. And when you do that, the water and nutrients can't travel up to feed the tree. So really all this needs is a machete or some kind of sharp blade to cut around the tree. And then all you do is you can either start from the bottom and cut down and then pull up, or you can start chest high, cut around the ring of the tree and pull down and remove all of that outer layer to the surface of the soil. So let's see if this works. This is a quick video of doing a ring barking the Albizia, a small one. But you can see you don't even need any tools for this one. You can just use your hands and pull down. This is JC annihilating this little Albizia. And you can see how close he gets down to the root. So he pops them off as soon as it gets to that surface. But if you leave any of those pockets, that tree could just grow back. So you have to be pretty thorough. And then the next option that KMWP uses for these larger trees is incision point application. And one thing I didn't mention is that once these trees get to this girthy size, the outer layer of the trunk is much thicker, and peeling that bark off is not going to work. It's not going to come off and come down the way you would want it to, like in that first video. So what we use is incision point application, which is cutting little divots in the tree about a shaka apart and around the circumference of the tree, and then dripping in about 11 to 12 drops of herbicide. So for that, we always use PPE. We have the herbicide in a drop bottle. Some use a tape measure. We'll have to ask Dylan about that. And then you need that hatchet or machete to cut into the tree at a 45-degree angle to get deep enough into the tree to drip in. And when you use this application, the foliage and the top of the tree should turn white in about 4 to 6 weeks. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it over to Dylan to talk to us more about our field crew strategies and GIS mapping and how we are chasing Albizia in the Koʻolau Mountains. So Dylan, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Frankie.
Thanks. Stop sharing. There you go.
I figured to start us off, I'll just share with us a quick video kind of contextualizing what these trees look like in the areas that KMWP focuses on. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience might be familiar with more urban or rural settings for Albizia, but the truly remote areas is where we've been focusing the majority of our efforts, though not all of them. Let me just start this up for you. So the Koʻolau Mountains Watershed Partnership, we are partnered with a bunch of different landowners, major landowners across Oʻahu, across the Koʻolau Mountain range of Oʻahu. And we focus on these very high elevation, very wet areas where there's lots of precipitation, feeding our aquifers the most. And so these Albizia in these distant areas are found way up high on peaks alone, or sometimes in great big bunches. Um, these shots are from Manoa Valley. You guys might be familiar. They're found down in streams, and the most difficult part for us is just logistical. It's how to get there. So a lot of the access points are going to be wet, steep, kind of rocky terrain. Sometimes they're incredibly hot, really dry, um, and prone to erosion. Um, for the most part, our crew tries to stick to ridge tops for easier access. But again, we're not like driving to these sites. We're crawling through bushes and over trees. And yeah, sometimes the hike is kind of long. You can see our natural resource manager at the base of that tree there. And sometimes you can't hike to these trees at all. The terrain requires a little more equipment. So our field leader Jordan Lewis is rappelling down to that lone tree up at the top of Waiava. Just to reiterate the size of these, if you haven't walked up to the base of one, a tree that's been established there for a while can get quite large. Here we have two field staff treating it with the IPA method. Another one with natural resource manager Will Weaver, also treating with the IPA method. 45-degree angle cuts, a couple drops of herbicide, and yeah, way safer than bringing a chainsaw. Our old intern Angie, admiring her handiwork. Again, with trees this size, the shade and nitrogen fixation kind of like totally outcompetes the native understory. So here you'll see lots of mulesfoot fern, octopus tree, fiddlewood, very, very few native species left under this Albizia canopy. And after they've been treated, again, like Frankie said, it's kind of a major hazard. There's a lot of dead branches. It's easier to really conceptualize how big they are once the leaves fall off. But seeing a hard day's work, getting out in these remote areas and really visualizing the change is super rewarding for us. So that's hopefully gives you a better idea of the real world conditions under which we're trying to maintain our watersheds here on Oahu. Getting a little bit more technical, our crew goes out and treats these trees, but before that we need to find them. And the most traditional way of doing that is simply hiking up into the mountains, maybe bringing some binoculars or something, and just looking for them and putting them down on a map paper or electronic, or just, you know, trying to remember it in your head and inaccurately conveying it to your GIS or data manager back at the office. That doesn't usually happen. An alternative method is using combinations of remote sensing resources. One of the most accessible resources that I think you should all be familiar with is, surprisingly, Google Earth. Here we have Oahu. If anybody is familiar with the H3 driving into Kaneohe from town, oh, excuse me, you might recognize this stretch of highway here. There's your off ramp to get to Kaneohe proper. If you zoom in, you can actually see that on Google Earth, these Albizia trees have been 3D modeled, along with the highways and even bits and pieces of HECO's power line infrastructure. Um, so this is kind of like an incredible resource, um, allowing people to visualize not just from like a top-down perspective, which very, very few people are accustomed to, but from an oblique angle, something that you might be more familiar with as you're driving down the road. And so this is kind of like really interesting potential future for remote sensing and the like. Basically, how Google does this is they hire planes to fly transects back and forth, weaving across areas of interest, typically populated areas, with 5 cameras mounted onto their plane. And then they pool all of those pictures together along with some positional data from GPS satellites. And through a technique called structure from motion, they feed it into a computer, which runs all the photos through an algorithm and compares different objects in different photos, or the same object in different photos, and uses the sensor size and focal width of the cameras to basically figure out where the photo was taken in 3D space and then reconstruct a picture. And then from there, they go even further into a multi-view stereo dense reconstruction, basically creating a 3D model. This is not technology that is Google proprietary. These techniques have been developed and are being utilized across many different organizations, private, public. If you have a camera and a computer that can run the open source software required, you could theoretically make very small scale versions of these maps, typically with single objects. If you want to go out and buy a drone, you can start droning it up and take a ton of photos, probably by an external hard drive or two, and throw it in your computer and hope you get something like this. Now, of course, this is something that is focused on mostly residential areas, because that's main user base for Google. So these more remote areas, we don't actually have 3D structure of the forest. There's still imagery draped over a very nice digital elevation model, which is cool. But it's only useful. Well, the 3D modeling is great for us in specific locations, but at the end of the day, we still got to get up to the very top of the mountain, because that's where most of the trees are and where most of the rain is. So when Google Earth can't come through for us, sometimes we have to ask for help from other data providers. In this case, we acquired some imagery from Resource Mapping Hawaii, who expertly collected and compiled tons of aerial photos in very remote regions of the Koʻolau. And then we were able to upload these onto an online web platform. You can see here, I'm viewing this through a standard web browser. I'm just using Firefox. And then if we zoom into the middle of the forest, the imagery pops up, and we can actually see in pretty clear definition, this is a group of probably 3 Albizia trees right here, surrounded by various old growth ohia at the top of a small stream leading through a mix of native and invasive species to a larger stream. This is above Schofield Barracks. And the wonderful thing about digitizing all this information, not just seeing it with your eyes one time in the field, is we can look at it again and again and again and share it with other people. So this being a web-based platform, our entire crew can go to this map through a regular computer, no special software needed. And we've set up a grid system for people to systematically review all of these photos, looking for new trees that we haven't found already, to give you an idea of the point data for how many trees we have. This is from some initial mapping efforts. This is several thousand acres of super remote, very high quality watersheds, again, above Schofield Barracks. And so basically our crew's been able to, during the pandemic, go through, look at these areas, identify trees for us to target later, and then collaboratively, systematically convey to other people like, okay, this square has been surveyed, the color changes, nobody overlaps, all these points are shared with our GPS units for field usage. So the GPS units just got to synchronize all the edits and stuff. And it pulls all the information from the inter-ether web space, tube pipe stuff. I don't know how cloud computing works. And it's ready to go for them for when they go out in the field. So that means when people are in the field, they're spending more time removing trees and less time figuring out where they are, surveying them. So we're doing this for increased efficiency. Additionally, one of the things that collecting all this, sorry, I'm thinking here. Collecting all of this individual tree location data does is it allows us to really finely tune our prioritization and game plans. Here's an example of a product detailing that same area. Using point information, we can way more accurately quantify the number of trees in an area and figure out where the tree density is highest. And so this allows us to compare tree density in these bright yellow spots to existing infrastructure, these remote helicopter landing pads. They're not pads, sorry, landing zones. It's just a patch of grass on a hill. There's no real infrastructure up there. And figure out where we might need to figure out new places to land a helicopter for remote insertion, which side of an area we should focus on first, how much herbicide we might need to bring for IPAing trees, how much time it might take, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and of course, as we go out and we're doing these things, we have lots of great information, and the data from Resource Mapping Hawaii especially has been extremely accurate geographically. So not a whole lot of ground truthing has actually been required from our analysis based on that remote imagery. But regardless, we have to do due diligence. And as we're going out, treating these trees, ground truthing, following up with drone surveys, double checking, sometimes things look very accessible from the air, and then you get on the ground, you find out not so much. Yeah, I think that's it for my technical rambling. Oh yeah, Miguel is in the chat. Thank you very much, Miguel, for the imagery. Sorry, I didn't acknowledge your message sooner. We absolutely love it. I shed so much blood from my eyeballs staring at it. It's a huge pleasure. So thanks again.
That was awesome, Dylan. Yeah, that's about all we have for today's presentation. So yeah, we can look through the questions. Chelsea, do we have any so far?
Yeah, we do. And I just wanted to say thank you again, Dylan and Frankie and the rest of the Koʻolau Mountains Watershed Partnership crew for all the work you do. I mean, that was like a really great um, presentation to see like what happens on the ground and then what happens behind the scenes too, and seeing what Dylan does like with all the data collection and the planning and everything that goes into doing the work on the ground. So I really appreciate that perspective. It was really great.
Yeah,
Um,
if nobody from the chat knows, Chelsea used to be my boss at KMWP, and it was a lot of fun. I really miss the days of not being behind the computer and being disgusting in the field, covered in mud
Making
with her,
people cry,
making
but
people
also
cry.
smile.
Yeah.
Yeah, I miss it a lot. And I just love seeing just the program and expand and all the great people that are working over there right now. Um, Randy Bartlett, he has a question. What type of drone equipment do you use?
We are just using hardware. We're using the Mavic Pro 2 from DJI, which I believe, if it isn't already scheduled for decommissioning, it will be soon. I think the Mavic Air 2 is taking over. Software wise, I don't like paying subscriptions, even though it's usually easier. Um, a lot of the software that we use is I use Lychee for doing point specific surveys, which I do a lot of just because the area is so large. Um, uh, I know other people use like what else? Drone to Map or Maps Made Easy for the drone software, and occasionally I'll do that too. But just because the size of the areas that I typically have to survey are so large, I don't have time to bring out, you know, 10 drone batteries and sit on the mountain for 5 hours while the rest of the field crew does real work to do transects back and forth and get like a really, really nice um, ortho mosaic. And we've been lucky enough to have super high res imagery again from Resource Mapping Hawaii. So that takes care of a lot of the mapping for us. But smaller sites, I will fly transects using something like Maps Made Easy, and then bring that back into ArcGIS Pro. But you could totally do it with QGIS. That's open source. What's the Meshroom? Meshroom is an open source uh, structure from motion and multi-view stereo dense mesh reconstruction software if you want to try your hand at making those 3D models and stuff.
Thanks, Dylan. That's great information for drones. And I think, you know, just having the videos too, not just the survey that you can share with people for outreach or anything. It's just great to see that. We have a few more questions, and just to encourage people, please type your questions into the Q&A. You can also put them into the chat box. We love questions here. So Maria, she has a question. Sorry, Marie. For Albizia that has fallen on someone's house, do you guys do the removal?
Oh, it's a great question, Marie. So we don't do removal on like fallen trees on people's homes. That's more on the urban setting. Our focuses right now are primarily remote Koʻolau Mountains. However, we have a huge array of arborists on island that we do have. We have like a list set up. So if anybody needs that list of arborists who are certified and who are known for their work on Albizia, I can email that out to anybody. It should be live on our website in the near future. So that'll be public too. So, but there are other organizations who are working more, not as remote, but doing other projects on Albizia. So shout out to Albizia Project in Manoa, who are doing some really innovative things with Albizia in our urban settings too. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Frankie. And there are other community Albizia projects on Big Island Invasive Species Committee. They have, I think it's called Albizia Assassins, and they're kind of the first to start up this community Albizia project, and they've been doing really great work in the community. And I'm not sure about the other islands. I see Kyle, actually, from DOFA, he has a question. And let's see, what % of milestone is used for the incision point application? Is it still 100%? And maybe you could just explain milestone a little bit.
I'll let Dylan chime in on this one.
Yeah, sure. Currently, we are still using 100% milestone. Milestone is, yeah, it's a type of herbicide. We don't use it too much. It's pretty potent stuff. And so when we do go out in the field, we're typically bringing 100% concentrations and just reducing the volume applied. This is kind of to kind of make logistics easier, transporting the amount of stuff that we need, but also reducing the amount of volume of herbicide that we're bringing around, just in case like spills happen or something. Though I do know that other programs have been experimenting with alternative methods. I know Lion Arboretum, I believe, has tried a drill and fill method with power drill, cordless power drill, and they've been able to see great results with a lower dosage, although I believe higher volume. So in the future, I would personally like to see us or somebody else try and figure out if there's possibility for a lower concentration and still have the same level of efficacy.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, I think always fine-tuning control techniques, especially with herbicide, and always trying to get lower dosage. Franny responded, Dr. James Leary, who came up with the IPA technique, thought you could go as low as 50%. And then the project coordinator for KMWP, JC, he says, there are also control techniques such as ring barking that require no herbicide. So there are some different ways. We have a few more questions. Christine from Albizia Project, she has a question in the chat, and she says it's not KMWP specifically, but curious if anyone else has input. We work a lot with Albizia and have noticed significant differences in density depending on location of removal site. Outside of chocolate Albizia. Oh, I've never even heard of that. Has anybody else noticed there may be 2 different varieties here on Oʻahu? Also, thanks for the shout out.
Oh gosh, I'm not too sure about the different varieties. I mean, there are different species of Albizia here, but different varieties of Falmo. Dylan, have you run into anything like that or heard from the field crew?
We've killed a lot of Albizia. Personally, nothing really comes to mind. The biggest change, I would say, that maybe this is probably just age related and not a different variety or species. But as you mentioned before, eventually when the trees get really big, we notice that the bark gets considerably thicker and way less malleable. Maybe that is a different variety, and somehow it's just that variety that seems to make it to that size or that age, whereas the more common varieties with the thinner bark that are ring barkable just never get that big or die. I'm not sure. One thing, I'm glad that JC did bring up ring barking again though in the chat, because one thing that wasn't mentioned, I don't think, is that ring barking is actually a lot of fun. It's like really satisfying to like strip the bark and like just peel off like a really big chunk. It's yeah, if you like peeling stickers off electronics, you can apply your skills outside and for other purposes.
Just contact Dylan Davis. He has a job for you. Okay, we got two more questions here in the chat in just a few more minutes. So Monty is asking, using this detailed technological approach to Albizia, is there hope of eventual local eradication in areas, or does the wide seed dispersal range and lifespan of the seed bank mean eradication is not an option? Great question.
That is a great question. I think it's important to think about Albizia. It's not something that, just like a lot of other invasive species, it's if you think that it's going to be a permanent gone and taken out of the environment, you're not going to really be able to hit that end goal. You just have to keep battling it and bring down the number and populations over time. If you think that it's going to be done just like, okay, we can get this done in 10 years and remove it permanently, we're going to exhaust all of our resources. And eventually, like you said, the seed bank is going to be there and little ones are going to pop up. And if we think that we've controlled the population 100% and then we stop looking, those small ones are going to come up over a few years and the seed bank will keep building. So I think it's more of a long-term goal to continue to keep the population down. And this might not be something that we see 100% gone in a few years. This is going to be over the life of my life and who knows how long. But if we don't continue these strategies, then we're going to just be complete Albizia forest. So that's something to think about. But I think the strategies and techniques that have been brought up, like these 3D models and these new technologies, are really a huge strength in our strategies and a way to combat the issue faster and more economically viable. Dylan, you got anything to add on that one?
Yeah, it is very location specific for sure. KMWP has been putting a lot of work into Upper Manoa Valley. If you drive into Manoa and look towards the summit, you'll see the skeletons of a lot of these trees. And while the lower down areas are quite dense with Albizia, at the very least, the upper areas, which are going to be able to spread their seed probably further, in part due to elevation and proximity to trade winds. That upper band, yeah, I think we could get rid of all the Albizia in a few years. There are other areas where it's so dense that you could try, but it's basically going to be a huge reforestation effort, because once you get rid of those, you're going to have to completely replace them with something. Otherwise, it's probably going to be more junk that just comes back in and not really much of a net benefit.
Yeah, thank you, Frankie and Dylan. And yeah, I mean, the watershed partnerships, I mean, there's watershed partnerships on each of the islands. And I mean, they're incredibly cost effective and efficient in what they do in the areas that they cover. But it takes funding, right? That's another thing, is dedicated funding. Frankie's talking about continually. You have to keep up on those, and you can't just stop a project or stop controlling Albizia because there is a seed bank there. It takes dedicated funding for invasive species management, for these watershed partnerships and invasive species committees that are out there on the ground. Okay, Miguel, I think this is maybe more of a side conversation about producing 3D models, like kind of just stepping up the game here, and if that would be useful to develop 3D models of forests for invasive species management. I think that's great progress and great conversation you guys can have about that. And then last question here, is it fine to burn Albizia at the young stage after uprooting it?
I mean, I don't know if it's necessary to burn Albizia after you uproot it. When they're young, the seeds aren't mature, or they're not going to seed. So once you uproot it and take out that big taproot, you could probably just lay it on the side and it'll dry, and then put it in your compost. I guess if you're having a barbecue, you could throw it on the fire if you don't want to put it in your green waste. Yeah.
Albizia smoked sausage.
Ooh, it's gotta be good.
Well, we are a little past the time. I just wanted to give a big mahalo to Frankie and Dylan again and the rest of the Koʻolau Mountains Watershed Partnership crew for all the work you guys do, and Layla for helping out with this webinar and everybody that attended.